Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Epic History series on World War One. Now this is one of their more well-known grand series. It's also nice to get a chance to cover the First World War on the channel. We haven't done too much of it in the past, so I'm excited to jump into it now. Before I do, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. July 1914. Europe goes to war.
1914. The great powers of Europe are divided into two rival alliances. The Triple Entente. France, Britain, and Russia, united by fear and suspicion of Germany, Europe's new strongest power. And the Triple Alliance. Germany, which fears encirclement by its rivals. Austro-Hungary, clinging on to a fragile empire, and Italy, seeking gains at French expense.
And surely all of these countries and empires will still be standing once this war is over. It'd be crazy to think that one, or even more than one of them, could fall through the course of this conflict.
The spark comes on the 28th of June in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is assassinated by a 19-year-old Slav nationalist.
Right, we're sort of really jumping into the conflict here. It's worth giving a bit of background information to understand how exactly we got here, right? So this war doesn't spring out of nowhere. Of course, we always start with this assassination, but let's be honest, if Europe wasn't a powder keg already, if tensions weren't incredibly high, this would not have led to a wider conflict, right? It only does because there has been growing tension, nationalism, militarism for years leading up to this, right? Now, you could go back, frankly, decades. You know, following the Napoleonic Wars, there had been this concert of Europe system where the European powers had tried to negotiate and speak with each other, act diplomatically before it came to blows, before warfare started. And that had been a relatively successful system. It hadn't prevented all warfare between them. But as you headed towards the latter years of the 19th century, particularly as you had the unifications of Italy and especially Germany, tensions had begun to rise. Right? Germany comes onto the scene, this new unified country. Immediately, it's very powerful. Right? It's one of the European great powers. But it doesn't necessarily, or it feels like it doesn't get treated fairly by the other European powers as sort of a newcomer to the club. Now, it's sort of strange, right, because it was made up of a lot of countries that had been part of the European political scene, Prussia most notably. But the new Germany feels that they're not being treated fairly. They're not being brought into the colonization game, for example. And so, they in particular, but this is a trend that would be mirrored by a lot of powers, not just in Europe, but around the world, looking at you, Japan, would begin to build up their military in order to expand their territory and threaten the imperial territory of those countries around them, right? So tensions were growing and growing and growing. Of course, in response to that, particularly from Germany, other countries like Britain, they began to build up as well. And these countries began finding allies. Britain actually allies with Japan, right? It may seem like a strange alliance at first, but they had some interests in common, right? So militaries are built, alliances are forged, and tensions begin to grow, right? And this wasn't the first time these tensions had erupted, right? Russia and Japan actually go to war, which leads to major upheaval in Russia, a revolution. It doesn't quite overthrow the Tsar, though, right? So just to point out, we've been really building up to this point. Tensions are high. Everyone's ready to explode and go to war, using a lot of those big militaries they've been building, these new weapons they've created with brand new technology, right? Everyone's sort of raring to go.
Named Gavrilo Princip, Austro-Hungary accuses its Balkan rival Serbia of having aided the assassin and sends an ultimatum demanding,
which they did. The Serbian government was most certainly involved.
Humiliating concessions. Serbia rejects the ultimatum, and Austro-Hungary declares war. Within hours, Austrian forces are shelling Belgrade. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, feels honor-bound to defend Serbia, a fellow Slav nation, and orders the Russian army to mobilize.
And this is where we get those alliance systems coming in, right? So Austria gives Serbia this ultimatum. Serbia essentially has no option but to refuse. To accept would be a massive blow to its sovereignty, right? Austria knows they're not going to accept. What Austria basically wants to do is quickly go to war with Serbia and pound them into submission. However, because of these alliances that have been built and because tension is so high, other European powers begin to get involved, right? Most notably, Russia and Germany. Now, there's sort of a whole thing associated with this. We've done some reactions to Extra History series on World War I, where you see, especially between the Tsar of Russia and the Kaiser of Germany, who were related. They were cousins. A lot of the European monarchs were related. They were talking back and forth, and they didn't really want to go to war with each other, but they both wanted to step up and defend their ally, right? Russia's ally being Serbia, Germany's ally being Austria. And so they basically force themselves to the edge, and then they go over, right? They can't stop this process.
German Emperor Wilhelm II has promised his support to Austro-Hungary. He and his generals see conflict with Russia as inevitable, and the sooner the better, as Russian strength grows year on year. Russian mobilization is used to justify German mobilization, followed by a declaration of war on Russia.
Right, you can see this sort of escalation as everything continues, and there's this idea, especially among the Germans, the German high command, that Russia is this underdeveloped, lumbering giant that will take ages to get into the war. Now, there's truth to that, but they also sort of underestimate Russia in this initial phase. Now, like I said, there is some truth to that. Russia is this giant country. Throughout the war, it begins to find itself sort of outmoded a little bit by some of the other participants, and Russia in particular, its government is crumbled by this conflict. But, it's not necessarily what it stereotypes to be. Russia does manage to respond more quickly and forcefully than Germany, for example, thinks it could.
Russia. Germany knows war with Russia means war with Russia's ally, France. It has developed the Schlieffen Plan to meet this threat of a war on two fronts. First, its armies will advance rapidly through neutral Belgium to encircle and destroy French armies near Paris and win a quick victory. Then its forces can move east to deal with Russia, whose huge army will take much longer to mobilize.
Right, so first of all, you can see how through these alliance systems, more countries get involved. Austria and Serbia bring in Russia and Germany. Russia then brings in France. Going through Belgium brings in Britain. All of a sudden you've got a world war. You can also see how the German strategy, it relies on the fact that Russia won't be able to respond quickly. And if they do, the Germans, they're in a lot of trouble.
And so Germany declares war on France. 6 million men are now marching to war across Europe. Italy, however, remains neutral. The terms of the Triple Alliance don't bind it to join an offensive war.
Yeah.
The United States also declares its neutrality. President Wilson and the American public have no desire to get entangled in Europe's war.
Yeah, and these two are worth pointing out, right? Italy, who was integrated into this alliance system, sort of takes a step back and says, we don't really want to get involved. Now, as we know, they will play a role later in the war. Same thing with the United States. Now, the United States is far less entangled in this European system of alliances, and it's not really interested at this time in being entangled. And so it says, we're not getting involved. There's also far less a sort of moral imperative with World War I versus the Second World War, right? These are two very different conflicts in some ways. And so the U.S. is like, nah, we're not really interested. But, of course we know the U.S. will get involved, first in a non-military capacity and then in a military capacity. We also know, this time especially, late 1800s into the early and mid-1900s, is when the United States really emerges as a great power on the world stage. especially through their industrial and economic capacity, and this conflict, and the next, is a big part of that.
Britain is France's ally, but at first it's not clear if it will join the war against Germany. But when German troops invade Belgium, whose neutrality Britain has guaranteed, an ultimatum is sent from London to Berlin, demanding they withdraw. It's ignored, and Britain declares war.
August 1914. All right, here we go.
A British expeditionary force lands in France, while the German invasion is held up for crucial days by Belgian resistance at the fortress city of Liège.
Yeah, so the Germans are already encountering problems they didn't necessarily expect, which is, look, Belgium's a small country. They do not possess the military or industrial might of some of their neighbors, but they put up more of a fight than Germany expected. The German army is unexpectedly slowed down in Belgium, and so they're not advancing nearly as quickly as they expected to.
German troops commit several massacres against Belgian civilians. The atrocities are inflated by Allied propaganda and help turn public opinion in neutral countries against Germany.
Yeah, and so this is one aspect of the war, the sort of propaganda war that's going on, right? Waged on both sides, but in the propaganda war of World War I, Germany in particular finds itself to be a loser. Now, like I said, you look at the First War versus the Second World War, there's obviously a much clearer imperative in the second, right? It's not hard to see why you should get involved to stop the Nazis from committing the Holocaust. Now this one, it's a little less clear, you know? Now Germany is often painted as sort of the aggressor, but I'd argue there's a lot of blame to be thrown around for World War I, right? There was a lot of aggression and militarization among a lot of these countries. However, the propaganda warfare, like I said, Germany finds itself portrayed quite negatively in a lot of neutral countries. Particularly this matters in the United States. Now, you know, there was mixed opinion, right? There were a lot of German Americans, but the US finds itself inundated with a lot of British propaganda in particular, depicting the Germans as these violent brutes, depicting the war crimes, some of which they did commit, and also some of these inflated war crimes, making it seem even worse than it already was, but there were legitimate atrocities committed. No, not just on the Germans, of course, but those are the ones that are being depicted in the propaganda, and opinion does begin to turn against Germany. Like I said, I'm talking about the US in particular, but this is a trend that goes beyond the United States and a lot of countries around the world.
France, unaware of Germany's great encircling attack, launches Plan 17, an offensive into German territory. But in the Battle of the Frontiers, they're driven back with enormous losses on both sides. The British Expeditionary Force clashes with the German army at Mons, but the British are heavily outnumbered.
And I will point out, of course, a lot of countries have theoretical plans to defend themselves from an invasion or invade a country they may think hostile. That is true, but I'll point out that essentially all the countries involved here have very actionable invasion plans for their neighbors, especially Germany. And when I say actionable, I mean immediately actionable, as in the lead up to this war, even before the spark of that assassination went off, Germany was essentially saying, hey, or at least some of the German high command, they were ready to go to war. And a lot of politicians and military leaders throughout Europe had these plans ready to go, and they intended to seriously use them at some point, right? So it wasn't just theoretical. People were really building towards this conflict. Now, it may not have gone down the way they expected, but they were waiting for some type of conflict to erupt.
And soon join the French in retreat. The Allies make their stand at the River Marne, 40 miles outside Paris. Their desperate counterattack saves the city and drives the Germans back. Both sides suffer 250,000 casualties.
Jesus.
The race to the sea begins as both sides try to outflank each other to the north. A series of clashes leads to the First Battle of Ypres, where the Allies desperately cling on and prevent a German breakthrough. There are more heavy losses on both sides. The two armies then dig in along the entire 350-mile front, seeking shelter from deadly machine gun fire and artillery shells.
And this is where we begin to really see World War I as we recognize it, right? This race to the sea, where both sides race as quick as they can, and then they meet, fight, and dig trenches, and they really get themselves dug in, right? And this sort of trench warfare, it's not the entirety of the war, I don't want to mischaracterize it, but it is a big part of World War I, is this sort of very stationary and very brutal style of trench warfare.
Trench warfare has begun.
The war at sea. Let's get naval.
British warships win the first naval battle of the war at Heligoland Bight, sinking 3 German cruisers. Britain has the most powerful navy in the world, 29 modern battleships
For
to
now.
Germany's 19. They now impose a naval blockade on Germany, preventing contraband goods, including food, from reaching it by sea. The aim is to bring Germany's economy to its knees and force it to surrender. But a week later, the British cruiser HMS Pathfinder becomes the first victim in history of a lethal new weapon, the submarine-launched torpedo.
Keep an eye on those. They'll be playing a big part of this conflict. And keep an eye on, we're talking about the war at sea, keep an eye on civilian and commercial shipping, right? That'll be a big part of this too.
German submarines, or U-boats, have a surface range of 9,000 miles and can attack undetected from beneath the waves. They herald a deadly new challenge to Britain's command of the seas.
True. Yeah, this is a new era of naval warfare, and it really is. I mean, everything is changing. Britain has been and sort of remains the master of the seas. I mean, that's how it's built its empire. But we've got these new technologies, new dynamics are at play. It is a new era, and everyone's going to have to work that out as they go. The Eastern Front. Back to Russia.
On the Eastern Front, Russian armies invade East Prussia, but they blunder into disaster at the Battle of Tannenberg, where General von Hindenburg and his Chief of Staff, Erich Ludendorff, mastermind...
Keep an eye on those two. They might be important through this conflict and beyond.
brilliant German victory, taking 90,000 prisoners and destroying an entire Russian army.
Damn.
The Russians contribute to their own defeat by transmitting uncoded wireless messages. A second massive German victory at Masurian Lakes forces the Russians into retreat.
I will say there are incredible levels of casualties throughout this conflict, but if you really want to see where, massive amounts of people are being killed or captured at once, look at the Eastern Front. It's indescribable, honestly.
In just 6 weeks, the Russian army suffers nearly 1/3 casualties.
Jesus.
Meanwhile, Austro-Hungary's invasion of Serbia suffers a humiliating reverse at the Battle of Tser. Austro-Hungary's offensive against Russia also ends in disaster and...
It is funny because Austria-Hungary, like I said earlier, frankly, what they really wanted was to punish Serbia for their suspected involvement in this assassination. They wanted to go to war with them and sort of beat them up a little bit, right? But the war started, and it's not going very well for Austria. They're struggling with Russia. They're even struggling with Serbia. So they're not having a good time.
Retreat, with the loss of more than 300,000 men. The fortress town of Przemysl is cut off and besieged by the Russians. The Germans are forced to come to the rescue, launching a diversionary attack towards Warsaw.
Another common theme we'll see throughout this conflict, the Austrians getting into trouble and the Germans having to come to the rescue.
It leads to weeks of brutal winter fighting around the Polish city of Łódź, but there is no clear winner. Meanwhile, the Turkish Ottoman Empire has joined the Central Powers, declaring war on its old enemy, Russia. Turkish warships bombard the Russian ports of Odessa and Sevastopol.
Yeah, it's 1914, so the Ottoman Empire has essentially been through more than 100 years, and I do mean more than 100 years, of declining territory and influence, and they've lost a lot of that to Russia in particular. Now, throughout sort of the late 1700s into the 1800s, especially 1800s, and then into the 1900s, the Ottoman Empire has lost the vast majority of its territory. Now, a lot of that is to revolutions and uprisings, but their sort of main foreign adversary is Russia, which keeps pushing southwards into their territory, taking more of it, and encouraging those revolutions and uprisings, and supporting them wherever they can, right? So the Ottomans have got a real bone to pick with the Russians. Now, we talked about empires that won't survive this conflict, right? Austria-Hungary, Russia. The Ottomans are another example. Their empire will not survive this war.
While in the Caucasus, Russian troops cross the Turkish frontier.
The world at war.
Beyond Europe, the war rages on the world's oceans and in far-flung European colonies.
Right, and this is really why it's called a world war, because at this time, Europe has essentially colonized the world. Like I said, this is taking place in 1914. We've gone through an intense era of European colonization, right? Through, of course, prior to the 1800s, but especially intensifies in the mid to late 1800s when a lot of Asia and Africa is conquered by these imperial powers, and that makes this war worldwide, along with all of the new technologies that have come into play, technologies that allow you to, of course, travel and make war around the world, but also communicate around the world, right? So this is really a globalized conflict. Other conflicts in the past had been worldwide, something like the 7 Years' War, but this was truly unprecedented in its scale.
German troops cross into British East Africa, modern Kenya, and occupy Taveta, while Allied forces seize the German colony of Togoland, modern Togo. But British forces invading German Cameroon are defeated at Garoua and Nsangakong, while a 3,000-strong force attacking German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, is captured at Sandfontein. A month later, British landings at Tanga end in chaos and defeat at the hands of a much smaller German force led by Colonel von Lettow-Vorbeck. Cut off from Germany, Lettow-Vorbeck goes on to wage a highly successful guerrilla war against the Allies, tying down huge numbers of troops. In Asia, Japan honors its treaty with Britain and declares war on Germany. Japanese forces go on to seize the German naval base at Tsingtao.
Yeah, and we're seeing, there was fighting around the world. I talked about how Germany, as a sort of new great power, had felt a little offended that it hadn't been getting the respect it felt it deserved. One way that materialized was through imperialism. Right? Germany wanted more imperial territory. It felt it should get better imperial territory. And so this is sort of an opportunity for them to fight it out in Africa and for Britain or Germany or France to take more of that territory that they all wanted. Now, Japan sort of has similar thoughts going through its head, where it gets involved, it honors its treaty with Britain, right? Like I said, they were allies. But Japan has been very focused on expanding its imperial empire at this point, right? That is essentially why they go to war with Russia in 1905. Both countries are trying to expand their sphere of influence, and Japan has an eye towards expanding their colonial possessions as they enter this war, right? So that's going to be front and center for them the whole time. Now, as the war continues, for a lot of these countries, sort of survival becomes the number one priority, and the colonialism drops down the list a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still on the list. And especially when the war wraps up, all these European powers will go back to trying to grab everything that they want. But for some countries, like Japan, that is still their sort of number one goal.
The German colonies of Samoa and New Guinea surrender to troops from New Zealand and Australia. But in the Pacific, off the coast of Chile, German Admiral von Spee's powerful East Asia squadron sinks 2 British cruisers at the Battle of Coronel. Both ships are lost with all hands.
Damn.
5 weeks later, he runs into a British naval task force at the Falkland Islands. 4 of the 5 German cruisers are sunk. Von Spee goes down with his flagship. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, British troops seize control of the Ottoman port of Basra, securing access to the vital Persian oil that fuels the British fleet.
All right, winter 1914.
That winter, Austrian troops finally capture Belgrade. But the Serbs then counterattack and drive them back once more. The fighting in Serbia has already cost around 200,000 casualties on each side.
Damn. And, of course, you think about the numbers in absolute term, right? Because these are massive numbers of people being lost. But also, if you think about them in terms of the proportion of each country's population, you know, for a small country like Serbia, does not have a lot of people to throw into this conflict, you know? So if you look at the percentage of people lost, a country like Serbia is going to suffer greatly. All the countries involved will suffer greatly, right? And like I said, the absolute number is massive, especially in some of these bigger countries. But proportionally, this war is devastating for a lot of countries that get involved.
In the North Sea, German warships mount a hit-and-run raid against English coastal towns, shelling Hartlepool, Whitby, and Scarborough, and killing more than 100 civilians.
I mean, this is, of course, sort of deeply concerning and offensive to Britain, who, you know, it's this island. Well, you've got the British Isles, of course, Britain and Ireland. But, you know, they tend to see themselves as pretty separate from the rest of Europe. They've developed this navy to defend themselves from attacks on their territory, right? The Brits are not very used to fighting or being attacked in their country. Now, you know, this war and the next one, they're going to get used to being attacked or being bombed. But, you know, this is something that is like, whoa, what the hell's going on? We're actually getting attacked in our homes. This is, you know, not normal for us.
On the Western Front, the French launched their first major offensive against the German lines. But the First Battle of Champagne leads to small gains at a cost of 90,000 casualties.
And another common theme we'll see throughout this entire conflict, we'll see these massive battles and assaults launched. You've got hundreds of thousands of people involved, and you have casualties in the tens or even hundreds of thousands, but very little tends to be gained, right? Maybe a little bit of territory. The front line is pushed a little forward or backward. Not much gained for massive levels of casualties.
While in the Caucasus, an Ottoman offensive through the mountains in midwinter ends in disaster at Sarikamish. Turkish casualties total 60,000, many frozen to death.
Yikes.
On the Western Front, that first Christmas is marked in some sectors by a short truce and games of football in no man's land.
Yeah, this is a relatively famous moment from World War I, where sometimes you have truces between both sides. They come together, they play some football, they have Christmas celebrations amongst each other. I believe a lot of these celebrations would cease as the war continued, as it dragged on, and people felt the brutality of it. But this sort of highlights, and I think people use this to highlight one of the main, narratives about this war, which is this is a war that really didn't gain anyone anything. You know, this is a war that was essentially created by the higher-ups of Europe, whether military or political, because of these rising tensions, this desire to gain territory, to prove themselves against these other great powers. But it's the people of Europe that pay for it, right? All these millions of men sent out to fight, all the many who died, they weren't the ones making the decisions, right? And we see at the beginning of the conflict, they may have been willing to celebrate Christmas and play football with the other side. But they were the ones sent out there to die, even though it was their commanders making the calls, right? So that's one of the narratives you'll see about World War I. And it also sort of fits in with the style of combat here, right? We have trench warfare. We have this style of warfare we'll see where you just keep throwing men into the meat grinder, right? Like I said, extremely high casualties for extremely low gains, right? So that's sort of something to think about as we go.
The killing zone between the trenches. January 1915. World War I is just 5 months old, and already around 1 million soldiers have fallen.
Wow. Wow. I mean, look, obviously I'm aware of the immense toll of this conflict, the number of casualties, deaths, but that is such a rapid pace.
A war that began in the Balkans has engulfed much of the world. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, fight the Allies, Britain, France, Russia, Serbia and Montenegro, Belgium, and Japan. In Poland and the Baltic, the Russian army has suffered a string of massive defeats, but continues to battle German and Austro-Hungarian forces.
They continue to keep fighting, right? We saw in part 1 that Germany's Schlieffen Plan, their invasion of France through Belgium, actually, as we saw, really relied on Russia being too slow to mobilize in time. Well, that was not necessarily the case. Russia, though it is this sort of big lumbering giant, wasn't quite as slow as Germany had expected / hoped. However, that doesn't mean things are going super hot for the Russian Empire, right? They are not having a fun time, though no one is, frankly, but they've faced a couple of pretty bad defeats, but they did manage to get on their feet faster than the Germans expected, and they've turned this into a two-front war for Germany, which is exactly what the Schlieffen Plan was supposed to avoid.
Austro-Hungarian troops have also suffered huge losses and are humiliated by their failure to defeat Serbia.
Yeah.
In the Caucasus Mountains, Russian and Ottoman forces fight each other in freezing winter conditions. While on the
I mean, this all started, the assassination, essentially because after that, Austria wanted to dunk on Serbia. They were mad. And they've been given the chance to do that. Now it's totally spiraled out of control, but they've been given that opportunity, and they haven't really been able to take advantage of it. They're actually struggling in the fight against Serbia, right? Austria will struggle generally in this conflict, but it is a bit of a humiliation for them.
Western Front, French, British and Belgian troops are dug in facing the Germans, in trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland.
Total war. All right.
As part of the world's first strategic bombing campaign, Germany sends 2 giant airships known as Zeppelins to bomb Britain. They hit the ports of King's Lynn and Great Yarmouth, damaging houses and killing 4 civilians.
Yeah, I mean, we really see a lot of new things come to the table with this war, or I should say new things on such a large scale, right? With all the new technologies in place, the new strategy, some of the old strategy being used in accordance with these new technologies. Now, some of the things we'll see, in fact, most of them had been debuted in other conflicts or training, but this is just such a larger scale than had been seen previously, right? Earlier in the 1800s, you'd had the American Civil War, you had the Crimean War, you'd had conflicts, especially colonial conflicts since then, where we'd seen some of these new technologies, some trench making, some new weaponry at play, but just nothing of this scale. And so we see, for the first time, in this scale, we see air warfare, right? Warfare from above, a whole new domain to fight in, right? There have been bits and pieces in the past, but usually you'd had land and sea. Well, now you've got air. You have all these new technologies. You have trench warfare, which obviously very much characterizes this entire conflict, right? So we see a lot of things here that, like I said, were not necessarily entirely new, but they'd never been used on such a large stage before, at such high numbers.
At sea, at the Battle of Dogger Bank, the British Navy sinks one German cruiser, but the rest of the German squadron escapes. Command of the seas has allowed Britain to impose a naval blockade of Germany, preventing vital supplies, including food, from reaching the country by sea. Germany now retaliates with its own blockade.
Right, and they're talking about total war here. Of course, you know, you'd had various forms of this in the past. The civilian population of various countries had been involved in some way with war during wartime. But it is, once again, to a new scale, right? The economies and citizenry of each of these countries is in large part mobilized to contribute to the war effort, right? They're not just fighting each other, they're setting up blockades, trying to block trade to each country, trying to block out food supplies. You'll see sort of an important part of this conflict, and especially with the involvement of the United States, is attacks on shipping vessels. Mostly unarmed, sometimes they actually were armed, but attacks on essentially civilian crafts, right? So the civilians, the economy, it all gets wrapped up into this conflict.
It declares the waters around the British Isles to be a war zone, where its U-boats will attack Allied merchant ships without warning. Britain relies on imported food to feed its population. Germany plans to starve her into surrender.
Yep.
On the Eastern Front, German Field Marshal von Hindenburg launches a winter offensive and inflicts another massive defeat on the Russian army at the Second Battle of Masurian Lakes.
I already made this point last time, but as we know, Hindenburg will become a very important German political leader. Very important, right? Following this conflict. So, this is someone that you absolutely want to keep an eye on to see how his exploits during the war contribute to his sort of popularity and leadership. Well, frankly, both during and following the war.
The Russians lose up to 200,000 men, half of them surrendering amid freezing winter conditions. The Russians have more success against Austria-Hungary. The city of Przemysl falls after a 4-month siege, netting the Russians 100,000 prisoners. Austria-Hungary's total losses now reach 2 million.
Damn.
Meanwhile, the British and French send warships to the Dardanelles to threaten Constantinople, capital of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. They believe a show of force will quickly cause Turkey to surrender. They bombard Turkish shore forts in the narrow straits, but 3 battleships are sunk by mines and 3 more damaged. The attack is called off.
Yeah, there's a lot of moments throughout the war, especially early on, when people are saying, this will end quickly, these guys are going to surrender quickly. It never happens as quickly as they hope. This is a conflict that drags on. It's a conflict that destroys several empires, right? The Austrian Empire, Austria-Hungary, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, right? Several empires are rent asunder by this conflict, but that doesn't mean that they give up quickly. Trench deadlock.
On the Western Front, the British attack at Neuve-Chapelle. But the advance is soon halted by German barbed wire and machine guns. British and Indian units suffer 11,000 casualties, about a quarter of the attacking force.
It's worth talking about. You know, we mentioned last time, this is primarily a world war because of the European colonial empires, right? They started fighting around the world. But it's also a world war in the sense that even in Europe, you have troops drawn from around the world, right? Canadians, for example, a lot of Indians here, right? There's troops drawn from a lot of these European colonial territories. They're brought over to Europe to fight, or they're fighting around the world in their own countries, right? So this is an extremely international conflict, essentially wherever you look.
6 weeks later, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans attack with poison gas for the first time on the Western Front.
Yeah, so we talked about the new technologies. Here's a, relatively new technology that is being used for the first time in such scale. And of course, many of the new wartime technologies will become extremely controversial during this conflict. Some of them even banned afterwards due to the horrors that they inflicted.
A cloud of lethal chlorine forces Allied troops to abandon their trenches. But the Germans don't have enough reserves ready to exploit the advantage. Soldiers on both sides are quickly supplied with crude gas masks as a chemical weapons arms race begins.
I will say, this is, I do think, one of the more sort of harrowing aspects of this conflict, how brutal it was. A lot of sort of horror associated with this period, I find, is often associated with that gas mask. It's an image people find quite frightening because of, I think, everything associated with it, right? This is some pretty terrible stuff.
The Allies land ground troops at Gallipoli, including men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs. Their goal is to take out the shore forts that are preventing Allied warships reaching Constantinople. But they immediately meet fierce Turkish resistance and are pinned down close to the shore. The day before the landings, the Ottoman Empire begins the systematic deportation and murder of ethnic Armenians living within its borders.
Yeah, so if all of the war crimes weren't bad enough and civilian massacres, we've got a genocide that has begun to take place, right? This was really not a good time for the world. And by, this time, I'm talking essentially about World War I and running all the way through World War II. We saw immense levels of atrocity, never seen before and never seen since, right? So, you're doing any videos on either of the world wars, you're going to get a lot of this horrific conflict, war crimes, genocide.
The Armenians are a long-persecuted ethnic and religious minority, suspected of supporting Turkey's enemies.
Right.
Tens of thousands of men, women, and children are transported to the Syrian desert and left to die. In all, more than 1 million Armenians perish. The Allies condemn the events as a crime against humanity and civilization and promise to hold the perpetrators criminally responsible. To this day, the Turkish government disputes the death toll and that these events constituted a genocide.
Yeah, there's a lot of denialism of the Armenian genocide in Turkey, of course, in particular, but also around the world. This has changed somewhat recently, or is beginning to change, but for a long time, and still today, a lot of countries still do not recognize the Armenian genocide because they want to maintain a good relationship with Turkey. Some countries only recognize it very recently, right? So this has been an issue for a while, sort of the recognition of this event. German advances in the east.
On the Eastern Front, a joint German-Austro-Hungarian offensive in Galicia breaks through Russian defenses, recapturing Przemysl and taking 100,000 prisoners. It is the beginning of a steady advance against Russian forces. At sea, the British passenger liner Lusitania, sailing from New York to Liverpool, is torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland without warning.
Big moment.
1,198 passengers and crew perish, including 128 Americans.
I think I talked about this last time, but they mentioned the German U-boats last time. We talked about total war today. right? How this is engulfing a lot of civilians and civilian economies. And the German U-boats were particularly unpopular in the United States, right? Killing American civilians, attacking, a lot of these trade vessels. And so the Lusitania in particular was a very well-known incident in that sort of process of dragging America closer to entering the war. Of course, it'll be a bit before they do, but this is one of those events.
US President Woodrow Wilson and the American public are outraged. But Germany insists the liner was a fair target, as the British used her to carry military supplies. In May, the Allies launched the Second Battle of Artois, in another effort to break through the German lines. The French make the main attack at Vimy Ridge, while the British launch supporting attacks at Aubert Ridge and Festubert. The Allies sustain 130,000 casualties and advance just a few thousand yards.
Damn.
That summer, above the Western Front, the Fokker Eindecker helps Germany win control of the air. It's one of the first aircraft with a machine gun able to fire forward through its propeller, thanks to a new invention known as interrupter gear. Allied aircraft losses mount rapidly in what becomes known as the Fokker Scourge.
Here we see the sort of beginning of dogfighting, a la these planes fighting in the sky, very iconic part of World War I, of course, would continue afterwards. And now we're getting to Italy's entry into the war. So we've seen Italy was supposed to be with the Central Powers, but sort of demurred when the war began. They were like, nah, we're not so interested. We don't really want to get into this conflict. Look, we agreed on a defensive pact, but this ain't defensive. So, I wonder on whose side Italy will join. I mean, I'm sure we all know, but it's sort of an interesting part of the conflict, right?
Italy, swayed by British and French promises of territorial gains at Austria-Hungary's expense, joins the Allies.
And we know Italy has got long beef with Austria-Hungary, or it's more accurate to say Italians do, right? Before Italy was a state, we're talking prior to the mid-1800s, Austria had a lot of influence throughout the Italian peninsula, but especially in northern Italy. And even, you can see on this map here, right, there's a lot of territory around this area, and frankly, going into the Balkans on the Dalmatian coast, that Italy would like to take from Austria-Hungary. Now, I mean, they have more broad territorial ambitions, but even more modestly, there's a lot of territory around here that Italy wants.
War on Austria-Hungary, and later the Ottoman Empire and Germany. The Italian army makes its first assault against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River, but is repulsed with heavy losses. Meanwhile, the Allies face a crisis on the Eastern Front.
Uh-oh.
The Russians have begun a general retreat, abandoning Poland. German troops enter Warsaw on the 5th of August. Tsar Nicholas II dismisses the Russian army's commander-in-chief, Grand Duke Nicholas, and takes personal command.
Yeah, so the Tsar, he really gets involved. He takes personal command. He's extremely involved in micromanaging the war effort. This does not go very well for him, because, I mean, if he wasn't being blamed already, now he is getting directly blamed for everything that goes wrong. It also takes him away from his political responsibilities and sends him towards the front lines, right? So if something's going on in St. Petersburg or Moscow, say, I don't know, protests that may lead to riots or perhaps revolution, Nicholas is not the quickest to respond, right? He's busy with the front lines. And of course, he's not particularly good at this job either. So this is just not a good idea from him.
It will prove disastrous for the Tsar, as he becomes more and more closely tied to Russian military defeat. At Gallipoli, the Allies land reinforcements at Suvla Bay, But neither they nor a series of fresh attacks by the Anzacs can break the deadlock. Conditions for both sides are terrible. Troops are tormented not only by the enemy, but by heat, flies, and sickness. In the Atlantic, a German...
Of course, you know, a lot of countries around the world, everyone's got some stories from World War I or World War II that play a big part in their sort of national mythology. So what we're seeing there, a lot of this is still remembered by New Zealand and Australia today. As a big part of their sort of history.
U-boat sinks the liner SS Arabic. 44 are lost, including 3 Americans.
Uh-oh, not good.
In response to further US warnings, Germany ends all attacks on passenger ships.
Oh, well, there you go. Surely no conflict will break out between the US and Germany now. Surely Germany would never continue with the U-boats after they've agreed not to. Anyway, that's what we've got to now, is Germany is like, uh-oh, if we keep sinking these passenger ships, even if they do have guns on them for the Brits, the Americans may get involved, and that's bad news for us. So we're going to back off for now. The Great Autumn Offensive.
On the Western Front, the Allies mount their biggest offensive of the war so far, designed to smash through the front and take pressure off their beleaguered Russian ally. The French attack in the Third Battle of Artois and Second Battle of Champagne. The British, with the help of poison gas, attack at Loos.
Uh-oh.
Despite initial gains, the attacks soon get bogged down, with enormous losses on all sides.
Damn.
Allied troops land at Salonika in Greece to open a new front against the Central Powers and bring aid to Serbia. But the Allies are too late. Bulgaria joins the Central Powers, and their joint offensive overruns Serbia in 2 months.
There you go. Serbia finally taken down, with Bulgaria joining the war. It's worth pointing out that one of the conflicts sort of prior to the beginning of World War I, in fact, a couple of conflicts, are the Balkan Wars, where essentially, as the Ottoman Empire is crumbling, it's been crumbling throughout the 1800s, but into the early 1900s, the newly independent or becoming independent countries of the Balkans, as they fight for their independence, they gain it, maybe they're sort of autonomous within the Ottoman Empire, they begin to vie for territory. And at first, they're sort of united against the Ottomans, but as the Ottomans recede out of the region, they start fighting each other, right? So there's a lot of bad blood between the peoples and countries of the Balkans at this point, you know, as we've reached World War I.
Winter, the remnants of the Serbian army escape through the Albanian mountains. Their losses are horrific.
Yeah.
By the end of the war, a third of Serbia's army has been killed.
Yeah, Serbia sort of valiantly resists initially, and the resistance is always valiant, but, you know, they can't hold out in the end, and Serbia takes pretty devastating losses, both of military personnel and of civilians.
The highest proportion of any nation.
There you go.
Fierce fighting continues on the Italian front, as Italian troops launch the third and fourth battles of the Isonzo.
I would say this is something you see a lot of in World War I, are front lines that are so stagnant that you see the first battle of blank, the second battle, the third battle, right, as essentially the same battle continues to be fought in the same place, because, like I said, those front lines move so little.
Hungarian forces, though outnumbered, are dug in on the high ground and impossible to dislodge. In the Middle East, a British advance on Baghdad is blocked by Turkish forces at the Battle of Ctesiphon, 25 miles south of the city. The British withdraw to Kut, where they are besieged. The Allies abandon the Gallipoli campaign. 83,000 troops are secretly evacuated without alerting Turkish forces. Not a man is lost. It's one of the best executed plans of the war. The campaign has cost both sides $250,000.
Yeah, they managed to get out of there, but Gallipoli is sort of seen as a black mark on Britain during this war. Pretty devastating. Churchill, who's sort of in charge of the whole thing, it's a black mark on his record, right? So this was not a great moment. And it may be, like I said, it's a big part of Australian, New Zealand history. It may be remembered sort of valiantly, but it's not remembered fondly, right? This is a dark moment.
Casualties. 1915 is a bad year for the Allies. Enormous losses for no tangible gains.
Right.
But there is no talk of peace. Instead, all sides prepare for even bigger offensives in 1916, with new tactics developed from earlier failures. All sides still believe a decisive battlefield victory is within grasp.
Damn. All right.
World War I was supposed to have been a short and glorious war.
Yeah, apparently.
But by 1916, a new kind of industrialized warfare had seen the death toll soar into the millions, with no end in sight. Naval blockades were beginning to cause shortages of food and fuel across Europe.
Well, we discussed the concept of total war last time, right? We saw that this was affecting not just the soldiers, not just the military-aged male population, but the entire citizenry of each country, right? Their economies were becoming dedicated to keeping this massive worldwide war going. Blockades were being done. Germany tried to blockade Britain, Britain trying to blockade Germany, shortages of food, other supplies. Right, this was difficult for everybody. Of course, you'd seen civilian populations and economies dedicated to warfare before. It's not like this was a first, but sort of the scale and the level of that dedication and how affected people were was unprecedented, as with many things about World War I.
While thousands of women had entered the workforce, replacing the men sent to fight in their millions. All sides were preparing for a long war.
War of attrition. Yeah, this war began. Everyone was hoping for the big, glorious battle. They could blow each other up with their new technology, end the war quickly. But by this point, and frankly, before this point, it had become a war of attrition, right? Everyone was entrenched, literally in this case, facing each other, gaining very little pieces of territory, turned into a war of attrition, right? Can you wear your enemy down over time? Now, that could mean wearing them down in terms of supplies, but it often meant literally manpower, right? If your enemy kept losing more and more men, well, maybe eventually they would surrender, right? This was, a lot of wars are wars over land. So little land throughout this war was lost and gained, apart from a couple of points, right? Most of it, both sides are entrenched, fighting over a little chunk of land. It was really human lives that were being fought over, right? Many millions of people were being sent into the meat grinder, essentially, sent forward to die, not really gaining much territory, right? That's how we get to this war of attrition.
The war has raged for a year and a half as the Allies continue to battle the Central Powers, recently joined by Bulgaria. At sea, the British maintain their naval blockade of Germany, preventing the import of food and other vital raw materials. Germany has retaliated with a U-boat blockade of Britain, but has to limit its attacks to avoid provoking the neutral USA, whose citizens have already been caught in the crossfire.
Yep, we saw that German U-boats were targeting civilian ships, trading vessels. Now, to be fair, those trading vessels were often carrying arms for the British, but in targeting those trading vessels, they often killed a lot of civilians, including American civilians. And so, you know, not wanting to provoke the ire of the United States, Germany, for now, has pulled back on the U-boat warfare. Now, as we know, that does not last forever. America does eventually get involved in the conflict, but at the moment, that is something Germany is trying to avoid.
On the Western Front, French, British and Belgian troops are dug in opposite the Germans. Both sides trapped in the bloody stalemate of trench warfare.
Yeah.
On the Eastern Front, the Russians have ended their long retreat and stabilized the line, but their army has suffered huge losses. On the Italian front, Italian troops have launched a series of costly, unsuccessful attacks against strong Austro-Hungarian defences. While on the Balkan front, the Central Powers have overrun Serbia, whose army is forced to make a bitter retreat through the Albanian mountains.
Yeah, we saw that Serbia had so valiantly resisted Austria from the beginning of the war, and this, of course, was sort of the initial epicenter, right? This is where and why the war kicked off. Now, very quickly, the center of the conflict moved away. Serbia had resisted until more countries, particularly Bulgaria in this place, got involved, and the Serbian army had been pushed out. Serbia losing an immense amount of soldiers and civilians, especially if you consider the small population of the country.
Now, on the 5th of January, Austro-Hungarian troops attack Montenegro. They are delayed at the Battle of Mojkovac, but 3 weeks later, Montenegro is forced to surrender. On the Caucasus front, the Russians launch a surprise winter offensive against Ottoman Turkish forces. 6 weeks later, Russian troops occupy the city of Erzurum. In April, they capture the Black Sea port of Trebizond. Meanwhile, the British transport 2 motorboats to Lake Tanganyika in Africa. They finally arrive after a 10,000-mile trip by sea and land.
Damn.
And help the British seize control of the strategic lake from local German forces.
How about that?
The same month, in German Cameroon, German troops besieged on Mora Mountain for 18 months finally surrender to the Allies. It marks the end of the Cameroon campaign.
Verdun, the mill on the Meuse.
On the Western Front, the Germans unleash a devastating assault on the French fortress town of Verdun. German General Erich von Falkenhayn knows France will defend this symbolic town to the last man. His plan, in his own words, is to bleed France white in its defense. It is the strategy of attrition.
Yep, and of course Verdun is one of the most famous battles of this conflict, and if we're talking about World War I as a war of attrition, this is one of the battles that's most emblematic of that, right? This is one of the best examples. You can really see that attrition at play here.
Verdun becomes one of the most terrifying battles of the war. A mincing machine, where infantry divisions are destroyed almost as fast as they can be fed into the line.
I think I used that same comparison earlier.
In Britain, 1 million men have already volunteered for military service. But the government realizes it won't be enough. Britain becomes the last major power to introduce conscription. That spring, on the Western Front, British troops are the last to be issued with steel helmets. The nature of trench warfare produces a high proportion of head wounds. The German Stahlhelm, the French Adrian helmet, and the British Mark I steel helmet offer limited protection from shell splinters and shrapnel.
I think those helmets are one of the more iconic sort of pieces of clothing from this conflict, pieces of armor, especially the German and the British helmets. They are pretty iconic, very closely associated with World War I, along with the gas masks that I talked about in the last episode. But you can imagine you're stuck there in a trench. You've got, oftentimes a lot of, sometimes literal artillery, but oftentimes shrapnel, rubble, you got a lot of stuff falling on your head. And so, like they said, the helmets can provide, some protection.
Neutral Portugal has been cooperating with the British, which seems to offer the best chance of holding on to her African colony,
Right.
Portuguese Angola. On the 9th of March, Germany retaliates by declaring war on Portugal.
You see this a lot with a lot of wars, but the world wars especially, where some countries sort of want to remain neutral, but their neutrality is it's not real neutrality, right? They don't want to get involved in the war, but they've taken a side, right? Portugal, a historical ally of Britain, they continue to be allied here. You can see it in World War II, especially, even in a little bit in World War I, but especially in World War II, where America is obviously on the side of the Brits. They're selling and loaning them a bunch of weapons. They're doing a lot of deals with them, but they're technically neutral, right, up until Pearl Harbor, right? So neutrality doesn't always actually mean neutrality. It usually just means I don't want to be involved in the war itself, even if I have a preferred side.
On the Eastern Front, Russia launches an attack near Lake Narok to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. But it's a disaster. There are 100,000 Russian casualties, and the attack fails to divert any German troops from the fighting at Verdun. In Dublin, Irish Republicans launch an armed revolt against British rule. It becomes known as the Easter Rising, and is put down after 6 days of street fighting.
Yeah, I mean, with war comes strife, revolution, riots. Of course, not in this episode, but I believe in the next one, we're going to see the revolution in Russia. I don't know how much they get into that, but with such a massive conflict, so much destruction, so much chaos, you're going to get some political strife. The Arab Revolt, okay.
In the Middle East, after a 5-month siege, British forces at Kut surrender. General Townsend leads 9,000 British and Indian soldiers into captivity. About half later die from starvation or disease.
So things aren't going super hot for the Brits in the Middle East yet.
Britain wants Arab support in its fight against the Ottoman Empire, so it's promised Arab leaders an independent Arab state after the war. But
yeah, there's a couple of deals being made, some of which literally conflict with each other. So Britain's doing a bit of double dealing. But the idea here is, right, that Britain wants to take the fight to the Ottoman Empire. They want to help out especially their ally Russia. And they know, the Ottoman Empire's been crumbling for more than 100 years at this point. It's been losing territory. A lot of the territory they've lost has been in the Balkans. That's been the most visible. But they know there are a lot of peoples throughout the remaining Ottoman Empire who'd rather not be in the Ottoman Empire, right? So they want to take advantage of some of that nationalism or sort of revolutionary ideology and use it to fight against the Ottomans.
now Britain and France secretly sign the Sykes-Picot Agreement, planning after the war to divide the Middle East into British and French zones of control. Unaware of this deal, Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca, leads the Arabs in revolt against Turkish Ottoman rule.
Britain's got a lot of things going on, right? They promise an independent Arab state. They've got this deal behind the scenes where they actually, essentially, want to carve up the Middle East into colonies or protectorates, or whatever new fancy word they've come up for to describe a colony. Of course, this is in this war. You also got the Balfour Declaration, which is what, leads to the creation of Israel, right? So you've got a lot of things going on. Like I said, the Brits are making a lot of deals that conflict with each other directly.
In the Battle of Mecca, his forces seize control of the Holy City. On the Italian front, Austro-Hungarian forces
I wonder if we're going to talk about T.E. Lawrence a little bit, Lawrence of Arabia.
launch a surprise attack at Asiago. Italian defenses give way. Austro-Hungarian troops are poised to break through into northern Italy. That month in the North Sea, the German High Seas Fleet clashes with the British Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland. In the only major naval battle of the war, the British suffer heavier losses, but claim victory as the German fleet withdraws and does not re-emerge from its base for the rest of the war.
Yeah, no one really wants to lose their dreadnoughts, especially the Germans, who've really been building this fleet up rapidly. I mean, the Brits had started building to match them, but no one wants to lose their precious ships. The big push.
For the summer of 1916, the Allies have planned major simultaneous offensives against the Central Powers, from east and west. Now they are needed more than ever to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and the Italians at Asiago. The Russians launched their attack first. On the Eastern Front, General Alexei Brusilov has carefully maintained the element of surprise. His troops break through the enemy lines, in some places advancing 60 miles and taking 200,000 prisoners. This brilliant, though costly, Russian attack achieves its aim, as the Central Powers are forced to redeploy troops from other fronts to shore up the line.
Russia finds themselves some success on the Eastern Front. Like they said, it is still very costly, right? All of this takes an immense amount of manpower, and you lose a lot of manpower doing it, but they have accomplished their nominal goal.
At sea, British cruiser HMS Hampshire, en route to Russia, hits a mine and sinks off Orkney. Among the 650 dead is Britain's iconic Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener.
Oh, interesting.
3 days later, in the Adriatic, Italian troop ship Principe Umberto is sunk by a German submarine. It's the deadliest sinking of the war, with 1,900 lives lost.
Jesus.
On the Western Front, Britain and France launched their major summer offensive, the Battle of the Somme. Hopes are
probably, I don't know, alongside Verdun, the two most iconic battles of this conflict. Maybe. The Somme, Verdun, they're definitely some of the most iconic battles. At least from a sort of British-American perspective. These are the ones I definitely hear about the most and that are most well-known from World War I.
High for a breakthrough, but the first day is a disaster. A long Allied artillery bombardment fails to knock out German defences, and waves of British infantry are cut down by machine gun fire as they advance into no man's land. In the space of a few hours, the British suffer 57,000 casualties, a third of them killed.
Damn.
It's the worst day in the history of the British Army.
Yeah, I mean, that is truly an immense amount of men to lose in that period of time. I say this every episode, but it's just hard for me to truly conceptualize or to try and have you guys conceptualize the amount of people that are dying in this, right? It's truly an incalculable, I mean, it's not literally incalculable, but to think of it, right? To think of it, it's so many people being lost in such a short span of time. It's truly unbelievable. And of course, incredibly tragic. The whole war is.
But more attacks are ordered, and the battle will rage for another 5 months.
Romania joins the war. Hey, new player.
Encouraged by the Russian advance, Romania joins the Allies. But despite an initially successful advance into Transylvania, Romania quickly faces a counter-offensive from German, Bulgarian, and Austro-Hungarian forces. The Allied force at Salonika tries to support Romania by launching their own offensive towards Monastir. With Serbian troops in the lead, there are small gains, but dogged Bulgarian resistance prevents a breakthrough.
You can always hide out in the mountains.
On the Western Front, General von Falkenhayn finally calls off the attack at Verdun. The French army has honored their commander, General Nivelle's promise. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. But victory comes at a terrible
Pretty iconic phrase.
price. 365,000 casualties. The Germans lose almost as many.
And this is where you really get to the sort of tragedy of the whole thing, along with the sort of critiques of the leadership in this one. I have talked about this in previous episodes, but, this is a conflict, of course, fought by the regular people of the world, right? Just your average folks. But they're not the ones who are planning it, or the ones who started it. Well, Gavrilo Princip was sort of in some ways a regular dude, but you get my point, right? It is the sort of heads of Europe, the generals of the continent, who are orchestrating this conflict, and the way they decide to do it, is sort of, in some ways, using older strategies with newer technologies, is just to throw millions of men into the meat grinder, right? It's not an incredibly ethical way of fighting. In fact, it's pretty horrible. Lots of people recognize that throughout the conflict, and that, of course, angers many people. Coming out of World War I, Europe is not a very happy place, right? People are horrified, they're upset, they're angry, right? A lot of people feel sort of betrayed in one way or another, particularly in Germany, but in other places as well, right? There's definitely a critique of this that, it's not really groundbreaking stuff, but that you've got all these ordinary people out there who are just being sent time after time to their deaths by the commanders or their generals at the top. It's a pretty despicable strategy, right?
Verdun remains one of the bloodiest battles in human history. For his defeat at Verdun, Falkenhayn is sacked, and Germany's heroes of the Eastern Front, von Hindenburg and Ludendorff, take command in the west. Meanwhile,
and these two are going to stick around. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, I mentioned this before. I think I mention it every episode. But of course, their sort of rise to prominence continues. And both during and after the war, Hindenburg especially, but also Ludendorff, they're going to be important political figures in Germany.
Battle of the Somme continues. Near the village of Flers, the British introduce a new weapon they hope can break the deadlock of the trenches. It is called the tank.
Oh, interesting.
But despite some small successes, the first tanks are too few in number and too prone to mechanical failure to make any real impact.
Prone to mechanical failure, getting bogged down in the mud. So, not a massive impact yet, but of course, we know the tank is going to be extremely important in warfare to come.
On the Eastern Front, Russia's Brusilov offensive comes to an end. Casualty estimates vary wildly, but it's clear both sides have suffered catastrophic losses.
Yeah. Holy shit.
Neither the Russian nor the Austro-Hungarian army ever fully recovers.
God damn. Talk about casualty numbers. You want to see the big casualties, look towards the Eastern Front, right? Yeah, they don't recover, and the empires of those armies don't recover either. I've been saying this, but look at the amount of casualties being taken, and then remind yourself that Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire, in that form, they're not going to survive this war. Both of them are going to collapse. Or be broken up, however you want to describe it.
On the Italian front, heavy fighting rages throughout the autumn, as Italian forces make repeated, costly assaults against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River. The Battle of the Somme comes to an end amid autumn rain and mud. The Allies have advanced 10 miles at the cost of 600,000 casualties.
Jesus.
German losses are about 450,000. The Allies reassure themselves that this is a winning strategy.
Right, and this is, I'm talking about sort of the critiques of the strategy during this conflict, all the men that were lost. You've got some of these generals at the top, military theorists, some people were like, this is not working, this is not how it should work. But some, some in positions of power were saying either this is how it has to be, or this is the right way to do it, right? We're gaining territory. We just need to toss tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of more men into this war to die into no man's land, right? There is, in some ways, a pretty callous disregard for the amount of people's lives that were being lost, which I think is one of the reasons why this war, along with its connection to World War II, of course, it's the direct lead up, in some ways causes it, is why this war is so closely sort of memorialized, remembered. The victims of the conflict are memorialized, right? We definitely try to do that today because the attitude during the war was a little different. Not from everybody, once again, not from everybody, but from some.
Because at this rate, Germany will run out of men first.
Ugh.
Meanwhile, disaster engulfs Romania, as the country is overrun by the Central Powers. Romanian forces suffer 250,000 casualties. The remnants of its army take position alongside the Russians on the Eastern Front. That winter, Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria since 1848, dies.
Talk about serving over an incredibly long period of time. From 1848, this man has seen the transformation of his country, the Austrian Empire, Austria-Hungary. He won't live to see the end of it, but it will end, right? But, I mean, he essentially lives from 1848, which is an incredibly transformative moment in his country's history, until almost the end of it, right? He sees a lot of history throughout his life.
He is succeeded by Karl. In Britain, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith is forced from office and succeeded by David Lloyd George, while General Joffre is replaced as French Commander-in-Chief by General Nivelle, who promises victory through bold, aggressive action. Amid the comings and goings, US President Woodrow Wilson's attempts to mediate a peace settlement come to nothing.
Yeah, though Americans have been pissed off by the Lusitania, I'm sure we'll talk about the Zimmerman telegram at some point, Americans generally are not, super happy with what's going on, but they still want to remain out of the conflict, and that's what Woodrow Wilson has promised, right? He said, I'm not going to get us into this conflict, right? And of course, Woodrow Wilson, being himself, wants to sort of step in and graciously mediate a peace. Now, it's not really going to work like that, but that's sort of where America is at that moment. But as we know, it's not too long until America does get involved.
Neither side is willing to make concessions. In 1916, World War I became a war of attrition. Both sides began to focus less on winning victory on the battlefield than grinding down the enemy and inflicting such enormous losses they would be forced to surrender.
Yeah, we talked about some of the tactics and strategies used last time. As they said, with the advent of trench warfare, these new technologies, right? Some of these things that had existed before but had never been used on such a grand scale, the war was becoming a war of attrition, right? Very little land was being changed between the two sides, at least if we're looking at the Western Front. Of course, there were different areas you could look where more or less land was being fought over, but we're looking at sort of your classic Battle of Verdun, Battle of the Somme. You were using a lot of lives to gain a little bit or no territory, right? Like they said, a war of attrition. It became more about how many of the enemy's men can you kill than how much territory can you actually take.
In 1917, the strategy will push Europe's major powers to the brink of collapse.
Yeah. Breaking point.
Germany knows it will lose a long war of attrition against the Allies, who have greater resources. So its leaders gamble. They resume unrestricted submarine warfare.
And this is where we're really going to talk about some politics in this one, and how the politics combines with the warfare, right? We're talking about total warfare. Almost the entire economies of these countries involved are devoted to the war effort. Almost the entire citizenry has some role to play, big or small, whether they're out there fighting or they're back on the home front, right? That means everyone's affected by whatever decisions are made in terms of the war, right? This war of attrition, this strategy, these new technologies are putting a lot of strain on, of course, the soldiers, the leadership, and the citizenry of each of these countries, right? So that's going to cause some big events. I keep saying this, but a couple of the empires involved in this conflict, they're not going to survive it. Of course, today we'll be talking about Russia, I'm sure. That's where the politics really gets wrapped up. But even here, Germany feels it's necessary, or they feel it's the right move to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Alright, I mean, you can understand why they make this move, but this is going to piss off some people, namely the United States, right? We've got a lot of things going on here, a lot of geopolitical and domestic political concerns at play. I've talked about throughout this series how, this style of warfare left a lot of people dissatisfied as you got into the war, as it went on, especially near the end. There was a lot of discontent. A lot of people they had become angry at the leaders and the generals of their own countries, right? They felt as soldiers, they were just being thrown into the meat grinder for nothing. We're not gaining any territory, we're not gaining anything, you're just leading us to our deaths, right? So there's a lot of discontent across Europe and beyond, and we'll see some of that erupt in this episode.
Believing their U-boats can cut off Britain's food imports by sea and starve the country into surrender within 6 months.
Right, and the citizenries of these countries are involved, not just because, each country is putting its people to work, but because these countries are targeting the citizens of these other countries, right? They're the enemy nations. And so Britain wants to cut off supplies and food to Germany, and Germany wants to cut off supplies and food to Britain. Obviously, that affects more than just the military, that affects everybody, and that's the idea.
But the new shoot-on-sight tactics mean neutral American ships will inevitably be caught in the crossfire.
And that's what happened last time with the unrestricted submarine warfare. So this is a gamble that Germany's taking.
Risking America joining the war on the Allied side. Just 2 days into the campaign, the SS Housatonic, an American steamer carrying wheat from Galveston, Texas to England, is sunk by a U-boat. The British then pass to the US government a telegram they've intercepted from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. Germany is encouraging Mexico to attack America if America and Germany end up at war. The so-called Zimmermann telegram puts yet more pressure on US President Wilson to declare war on Germany.
Yeah, so this is sort of the double whammy for the United States, right? Unrestricted submarine warfare begins again. We've seen what that could lead to before. The Lusitania, an American ship, gets sunk. At the same time, the Brits, very wisely, send on this telegram to the US. It's Germany saying to Mexico, hey, if we get into a fight with America, why don't you invade? America's taken a lot of territory from you. Don't you want to get it back? Now, I don't know how realistic any of that was. I don't know if there was ever a thought in the Mexican government's mind that they might invade the United States. I don't know. It seems kind of unrealistic to me. I doubt it, but just the existence of this put more and more pressure on Wilson. Now, I will say, I mean, I'm not a fan of Woodrow Wilson. Few people are. But there is sometimes this idea that, he sort of gets into office, essentially lies about getting involved in the war, and then gets involved anyway. On paper, that sort of is what happens, but I will say, to be fair, there is an increasing amount of pressure on him as the American public more and more wants to get involved. So this isn't really a conflict where Wilson sort of drags America in kicking and screaming. The public becomes increasingly interested in getting involved.
the Tsar abdicates. A provisional government takes charge.
Yeah, so there's a lot of discontent in Russia in particular, right? A shortage of food, as there is in a lot of other places. We've seen throughout this series, Russia had a particularly high death toll. Additionally, Tsar Nicholas, as we saw in previous episodes, decided to sort of leave his responsibilities behind and go and fight on the front. Maybe that's an unfair way of putting it. He wanted to lead the war effort directly. But what that did was it separated him from the domestic politics of Russia, which already didn't have too close a grasp on, and it meant that every military failure was very easy to blame on him. In fact, sort of impossible not to blame on him. So he became increasingly unpopular. Right? So all of this is the spark that sets off the revolution. Now, I've said previously, and I do think this is true, every revolution takes some sort of spark to set it off. But, you need the right conditions. If a country is entirely stable and prosperous and happy, there are a lot of sparks you can create that will not lead to a revolution. But if a country is unhappy, as Russia was, if it was unstable, they'd had another revolution in 1905, if they were dissatisfied with their leadership, then the spark of the war going badly, well, that's enough to set things off, which is exactly what happens.
Pledging to continue the war. But at the front, Russian troops begin to desert en masse.
Yeah. Because they're like, well, what are we even doing out here? I've talked about this perspective throughout the series. They're saying, we are gaining very little. We're all risking our lives. So many of us have died. The leadership stinks. Why on earth are we still out here? And so people come to the logical conclusion that they should get themselves out of there. Even if they have been ordered to go, a lot of these soldiers start to desert.
After a string of supplies.
Like I said, you sort of understand the rationale behind it. I mean, it's deeply, deeply immoral. There's a lot of civilians being killed, but there's civilians being killed throughout this entire war. And so, obviously, this is often framed as a sort of bad decision in retrospect, as it gets the United States involved. But it's not like there was no rationale behind it, right? Germany felt that they needed to do so. That was their perspective, right? I'm not saying they were correct or that I agree with that, but that they needed to in order to cut off Allied shipping to end this war. World War, not just because it was international in its scope, as in there was fighting around the world, but because where most of the fighting took place, Europe, there were a lot of people from around the world, right? We saw Britain had Indian soldiers in there. We have Canadians, right? Because these European countries controlled colonial empires around the world, they were bringing in a lot of those soldiers into Europe. So an international war even on the Western Front. We have some Canadian contributions here. Of course, this is a theme that will continue into the Second World War.
It's a limited Allied victory, but costs 150,000 Allied casualties to 130,000 German.
Jeez.
Above the trenches, the First Air War has reached new levels of sophistication and deadliness. Reconnaissance aircraft are crucial for spotting enemy positions and directing artillery fire onto them. Scout aircraft or fighters try to shoot them down before they can execute their mission. New models of aircraft are developed every few months, but that spring, the superiority of German aircraft leads to heavy Allied losses in what becomes known as Bloody April.
The Nivelle Offensive. There we go.
3 days after the fall of Vimy Ridge, French General Robert Nivelle launches his main offensive. Expectations are high, but after initial success, the advance bogs down, and casualties quickly mount on both sides.
Classic World War I moment, even if an offensive appears to initially being going well, or initially making some progress, mostly these bog down and you're left with little gained and a lot of lives lost.
The apparently senseless losses cause morale in the French army to collapse.
Yep, exactly. That's what I've been saying. You know, obviously Russia is the best example, but, you know, because they have a revolution. But it's not just in Russia, right? Soldiers around the world are feeling this way. Soldiers of all these different countries.
Whole units mutiny, refusing to attack. General Nivelle is sacked as French commander-in-chief and replaced by General Pétain, hero of Verdun, who promises no more suicidal attacks. That summer, at Messines Ridge, the British tunnel under the German lines and detonate 19 enormous mines under the enemy position. It's the largest man-made explosion in history to date, and paves the way to a brilliant but highly local British victory.
Right.
In Greece, King Constantine, who has favoured neutrality, is forced to abdicate, and Greece joins the Allies.
Yeah, Greece was having its own sort of political issues, its own tension between those who wanted to remain neutral, a sort of more pro-German faction, and a more pro-Allied British faction.
Russia's provisional government orders a new attack, but the July offensive is a disaster. The morale and discipline of the Russian army has collapsed.
Yeah, and we've seen the provisional government. They promised to continue the war. The war is already incredibly unpopular. That's, you know, the reason the revolution happens. People really don't want it to continue. The soldiers are already deserting the provisional government, led by Kerensky, as you can see here. They lead this sort of failed offensive. It makes them more unpopular than they already were, and makes the war more unpopular than it already was.
It can no longer be relied on to fight, and the Central Powers' counterattack is almost unopposed. At sea, the Allies begin to group their merchant ships into convoys, which sail under naval escort. The new system leads to a steady fall in losses. The tide is turning in the U-boat war. As discontent with the war grows in Germany, the German parliament, the Reichstag, passes a peace resolution, calling for a peace of understanding and reconciliation. It's ignored by the German High Command,
Right.
which now effectively rules the country as a military dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, look, we talked about the politics in Russia. Of course, Russia is the most obviously affected by the war in terms of political turmoil, but Germany probably comes in number 2. They're going to have an incredible amount of political turmoil. Of course, it's going to lead to more political turmoil in the future, in the interwar period. But even if you just look in the immediate, you're essentially going to see Germany have its own sort of failed revolution of their own, right? In some ways attempting to mirror the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. You know, not quite yet, but there's a lot to get to in terms of political instability in Germany. You can see the civilian politicians are already a little upset about all of this. You know, the German Social Democratic Party, that's sort of their big left-wing party, very powerful. They initially, though there's disagreement among the ranks, sort of agree to get on board with the war effort. they're generally in opposition to the government, but they agree, all right, we'll get on board, we'll support you throughout the war. But it's getting to this point, a lot of those politicians are becoming very unhappy, right? Because it's become clear this is not a short and glorious war. It's dragging on for years. It's leading to an incredible, unprecedented amount of death and destruction. It's also very unpopular. But the German High Command, who we've essentially, like Epic History said, entered into some type of a military dictatorship, they ignore that. They want to keep pushing, keep going.
In Belgium, the British launched their major offensive of 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres. It will be remembered as Passchendaele. Heavy shelling, rain and broken irrigation channels turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. In these impossible conditions, all hopes of a breakthrough soon fade. The attack is called off after 3 months, by which point the British have suffered 240,000 casualties.
Jesus!
The Germans, 200,000. On the Italian front, at the 11th Battle of the Isonzo, Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces batter each other into exhaustion. There are 150,000 Italian casualties, 100,000 Austro-Hungarian. That year, 1917, the list of Allied nations grows. Brazil, Liberia, China, and Siam.
So you can see that though the war clearly has not come to an end, there's still fighting to be done. The momentum is beginning to shift against these Central Powers, right? There's a lot of countries, most notably the United States, but also a lot of countries around the world who are now joining the war effort on the side of the Entente. The German U-boat tactic, though it found some success initially with the sort of work of the Brits and the Americans, the convoy system, it's beginning to be a lot less effective, right? Now, in terms of sort of land gained, we're still not seeing a ton of movement. And of course, Russia is having a hard time. They're being pushed back, struggling to even fight with the extremely low morale and desertions. But overall, things are not going great for these Central Powers. But it's not over yet, right?
All declare war on Germany as a result of German U-boat attacks, or to curry favour with the Allies.
Right.
China will contribute many thousands of labourers working for the Allies in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia.
Middle East, 1917.
That year in the Middle East, British forces avenged their 1916 humiliation at Kut by defeating the Ottoman Turks and marching on to occupy Baghdad. British forces in Egypt advance across the Sinai Desert, but are thrown back by Ottoman forces at the First and Second Battles of Gaza. In July, Arab rebels capture the strategic Ottoman port of Aqaba. They are accompanied by a British military advisor, Captain T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia.
Of course, Lawrence has become a very famous figure of history, very well known. Of course, there's the very famous movie about him. He's definitely a fascinating guy. I'd like to do more reading on him, potentially. He's an interesting fellow. He was someone who was intimately involved in these Arab revolts. Of course, sort of represented the British in that capacity, but someone who was a little bit torn, as I understand it. He was British, he sort of represented Britain, but, he felt some sort of allegiance to his Arab allies, didn't necessarily want the European powers to colonize the whole area. He was fighting for some sort of Arab independence or, independent nation state. Of course, he sort of plays both these roles, so seems like an interesting guy, but obviously played a big role in this part of the conflict.
That autumn, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issues the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for the creation of a national home for the Jews in Palestine.
Yeah, so I talked about this last time, but you've essentially got the Brits making a variety of deals and agreements, right? So they're simultaneously promising the Arabs that they're going to get an independent Arab state in the Middle East. They're promising the French that they're going to carve up this territory into protectorates, colonies essentially, and they're promising the Jewish people that they're going to get their own independent state in the Middle East, right? So Britain's making a lot of deals, some of which obviously conflict with each other. So, if you look at the current state of the Middle East and you want to find out, how did we get there? Of course, you could go back as far as history goes, but World War I is a pretty good place to start to understand how we got our current sort of geopolitical configuration.
The aim is to rally Jewish support for the Allies, but the declaration contradicts existing pledges to Arab leaders.
Exactly. Surely this won't cause problems, eh?
In October, the British finally win at Gaza, clearing the way for an advance into Palestine. 6 weeks later, General Allenby leads British troops into Jerusalem, ending 400 years of Ottoman rule.
Wow. Caporetto.
With Russian forces in disarray, Germany is able to move troops from the east to the Italian front. At the Battle of Caporetto, they help to smash through the Italian army, advancing 70 miles and taking 250,000 prisoners.
Yeah, so that's a tremendous amount of movement for World War I. We've seen how deadlocked everyone has been, but now that the Russians are sort of pulling back, if not officially, then just the troops are getting out of there. The Germans, they have some more resources, some more men, and like I said, this is, some of the most movement we've seen in a while in this conflict.
British and French divisions, desperately needed on the Western Front, have to be redeployed to shore up the line. In Russia, a second revolution brings Lenin's Bolshevik party to power.
Yep. And the slogan that the Bolsheviks get in on is peace, land, and bread, right? Shows you the three things the people cared most about, right? Number one is peace. They're done with the war. They want this to be over with. Land. That one points to land distribution for the peasants of Russia, right? Russia's mostly, at this point, an agrarian society. The peasants, they want some damn justice. And bread. People are starving. They want food, right? Now, it's fair to point out the Bolsheviks were not the most popular party or force at that time, but they were gaining popularity with the unpopularity of the provisional government, and they were well positioned and well armed with their particular support among some of the soldiers and the workers to sort of stage another revolution and take power, which is exactly what they did under the leadership of Lenin here.
He is determined to end Russia's involvement in the war. In France, Georges Clemenceau becomes Prime Minister. Nicknamed the Tiger, he promises total war and total victory. But for the Allies in late 1917, final victory looks uncertain. Russia has stopped fighting. French armies are recovering from mutiny. The Italian front has almost collapsed. And American reinforcements still seem a long way off. For the time being, the British are the only effective Allied force in the field. So the British attack at Cambrai, with the first major tank assault in history.
Wow.
On the first day, nearly 400 tanks spearhead an advance of several miles through German defences. But then the tanks break down or are knocked out. The Germans rush in reinforcements, and the gains are lost. Finland declares independence from Russia.
Finland's like, all right, now is our opportunity to get the hell out of here. We've seen some people decided this was their moment, right, to make a revolution or independence movement, whatever. We saw that in Ireland as well, all the chaos going on, right? I said it's most obvious in Russia, Germany as well, but there's political chaos everywhere, right? In a lot of these different places, especially the countries that are hit the hardest, right? We've seen there's been some chaos in France with some mutiny. There's definitely political chaos in France, right? Momentum is, we've seen overall sort of turning against the Central Powers, Germany in particular, but the war isn't over, right? Germany's making some advances. There's still a sort of largely stalemate on the Western Front. There's been a little more movement, some victories, a lot of lives lost. So the war's not over, right? You could still imagine it going a variety of directions. There was probably many ways it could have ended other than the way that it did, but we do see the direction that things are going.
Romania, isolated by the Russian collapse, signs an armistice with the Central Powers. 6 days later, Russia also signs an armistice. The Allied Eastern Front is no more.
Yeah, that's sort of a big hit for the Entente powers. The Eastern Front has just disappeared, essentially. Romania's like, well, we're screwed. We gotta get out of here. And the Bolsheviks, they take power on peace, land, and bread. Peace. They gotta end the war. They've promised to. They sign away a lot of territory in doing so, but they feel that is their mandate. The people will probably revolt again if they try to fight the war again, right? This is what happened with the provisional government. They got into power, things went badly, people were like, get the hell out of here. So the Bolsheviks end the war, right? So that's bad for the other allied powers, but they do have the United States waiting in the wings, a lot of manpower, a lot of industrial power, especially. That's sort of a big part of this. That will remain a true fact in the years to come. A lot of economic and industrial power, manufacturing power from America.
1917 has seen one major Allied power, Russia, knocked out of the war. But the arrival of a fresh new ally, America.
Yeah.
Germany knows only military victory can now save it from being overwhelmed by Allied resources, and begins...
Yeah, look, Germany is, in some ways, sort of fighting a losing battle in terms of resources at this point. Obviously we've seen there's a bit of a stalemate here. Not saying that Germany was incredibly overwhelmed, right? A lot of these powers are fighting on even footing, but now with the entire might of the United States, like I said, especially that economic industrial power, you see a lot of countries around the world are joining up with the Entente powers. They've got a lot of economic might, manufacturing might behind them. Germany simply can't match that. Not with its allies, right? Austria, the Ottoman Empire, they cannot match the sort of economic might that is now wielded against them. And so their one route is to go for a big military victory to try and end this war quickly.
Planning one last massive onslaught for the spring of 1918. After 3.5 years of war, the Allies are in crisis.
Yeah, Russia's dropped out of the war. The Eastern Front has essentially collapsed. That means that Germany and Austria, they can turn their attention fully, well, mostly fully, to the Western Front. That's definitely bad for the Entente powers, I won't deny it. But the Central Powers aren't necessarily doing great either. Germany, of course, is the main power we're talking about here, but they're now up against the industrial might of, both the United States, but also a lot of countries around the world. We saw a lot of different nations were getting involved in the last episode, and involved on the side of the Entente powers. Germany cannot match up to that. They, along with the European Entente powers, Britain, France, Italy, etc., they've been ground down by years of constant war, right? In terms of manpower, resources, industrial capacity. But now you got some fresh entrances into the conflict, right? So sure, Russia leaving the war is a big blow to the Entente powers, but, as I've said, the war is still going. It's not over yet. It could potentially go a variety of different ways. It's not like Germany stepped out on top. In fact, I think the momentum is more turning against Germany than towards it. Russia's gone, but there's a lot of factors that are not in Germany's favor. You know, the United States being a big one, but not the only one.
Russia has been rocked by revolution, and its new Bolshevik government has signed an armistice with the Central Powers. Thousands of German troops will be freed up to fight on the Western Front, where the carnage of trench warfare has already claimed more than 1 million lives.
Jeez.
But Germany is also desperate.
Right, exactly.
Britain's long naval blockade has led to shortages and social unrest at home.
Exactly. Both countries tried to blockade each other. You know, Germany also uses their U-boats, but as we saw last time, the U-boats have become a little less effective. The Brits and the Americans, using the convoy system, have managed to at least decrease that damage. So now, the blockade that's doing more damage is Britain's blockade of Germany. Right? They're starting to really need a lot of these supplies, especially food, that they are not necessarily getting. This is leading, of course, to military problems, but also an incredible amount of political unrest among these citizens of the country. And we just saw with Russia how that unrest among the soldiers and the citizens, that can lead to major issues, including revolutions or dropping out of the war. Right? So Germany, you know, they're in a lot of trouble.
While America's entry into the war brings fresh manpower and vast resources to the Allied cause.
Right.
Germany faces inevitable defeat, unless it can win a quick victory on the Western Front.
Yeah, that's basically the position we're in. You know, this has been a war of attrition so far, right? So both sides have been grinding each other down. But now if Germany wants to win, they're going to have to shake things up, right? They cannot continue this. You know, like I said, they cannot match the sort of industrial, economic, and manpower that is now being, or soon to be, used against them, particularly with the US. But like I said, there's also other countries involved. They need to win a big and relatively quick victory if they want to bring this conflict to a close. On their terms. The Kaiser's Battle. All right.
US President Wilson announces his 14 points.
Yep.
They outline his vision for a post-war world, including an end to secret treaties, a reduction in the size of armed forces, self-determination for the people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and an international organization to settle future disputes.
Woodrow Wilson always thought pretty highly of himself. He's already got an eye towards the post-war settlement, right? And he's laid out exactly what he wants to happen. Now, you know, once again, I could continue insulting Wilson, but, you know, we'll turn an eye towards what he's actually aiming for. And these 14 points, you know, they don't all come true. He pushes for some of them, lets go others, right? This is a negotiation following the end of the war, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit. But these 14 points do have a big influence. We're also really getting towards the start of the massive role the United States has in global politics today. Now, that had already been building up, particularly throughout the Americas, Latin America. The U.S. has done a lot of interventions already at this point. They're going to do a lot more, and they're getting more involved in sort of world politics and playing a big role, right? So this is a big step in that direction.
But most European leaders dismiss his ideas as wishful thinking.
Yes. Like I said, we're going to have a real negotiation after the war, and a lot of the countries, especially it ends up being the ones that he's allied with, are not interested in fulfilling a lot of the points he lays out because of the kind of peace they want to organize, but we'll get to that.
At Brest-Litovsk, Bolshevik Russia signs a peace treaty with the Central Powers. Russia gives up vast amounts of territory in exchange for peace. 500,000 German troops can now be redeployed from the east to the Western Front, where German General Erich Ludendorff plans an all-out, last-ditch offensive to win the war. Ludendorff's spring offensive catches the Allies off guard. German stormtroopers, using new infiltration tactics, help to overwhelm the British Fifth Army, which is soon in full retreat. The German advance threatens to split the British and French armies.
Yeah, and that is, of course, the goal. Now, years into the war, we are getting a bit of innovation. We're seeing, the lines really being pushed here. So far, it's been very stagnant. We've essentially been seeing a stalemate. Well, desperate, Germany said, okay, screw it, we're going to go for it. Of course, the goal is to split up the Brits and the French. You can take them on individually with all those German troops who moved over from the Eastern Front, right? That's the idea. And like I said at the beginning, the war's not over, right? We know how it's going to end, but there's still fighting to be done. Overall, I do think the momentum is against Germany, especially if the war lasts. But you can imagine in this moment, Ludendorff, the German high command, is thinking, if we can put this to a stop right here, if we can keep pushing, separate the Brits and the French, defeat them, this could all be over right now.
With disastrous consequences. So French General Ferdinand Foch is appointed Supreme Commander of Allied Forces to coordinate strategy. Outside Amiens, British and Australian troops improvise a defense and finally halt the German advance. The German offensive switches to the north, targeting the Channel ports.
But I will say, there is, of course, an incredible amount of history that's not being covered here, right? World War I is a massive conflict. There are a lot of different battles and events, and there's a lot of history to be done. I'm sure you can find videos and books and articles on each one of these battles that we do or don't go over, right? So there's a lot to be covered, a lot of really fascinating stories, but of course, we're doing sort of more of a broad overview here.
But the British inflict heavy losses on the Germans and prevent a breakthrough.
The dawn of air power. But I will say, as we're nearing the end of this war, as we're in 1918, I'd say we're beginning to see some aspects of the war that will continue on into World War II. Of course, World War I, World War II, there are significant differences. The First World War is so characterized by that style of stagnant trench warfare, but as we near the end, some of this air power, the tanks, some of the strategies we're finally seeing come to light, be innovated. Some of this is the kind of things we'll see, be worked on over the interwar period and reintroduced as we enter into the Second World War, which is, of course, a very different conflict than the first in many ways.
Above the trenches, the First Air War continues to escalate. Each side now has more than 3,000 aircraft in service on the Western Front.
Damn.
But by 1918, the Allies have won air superiority, thanks to greater resources. On the 21st of April, Germany's most famous pilot, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, is shot down and killed near Amiens. With 80 victories, he's the war's highest-scoring ace, and is buried by the Allies with full military honours. Britain's new
Of course, he is probably one of the most iconic figures from the First World War, extremely well known even today. A lot of history and stories about him.
Independent bombing force launches a daylight raid against Cologne. It marks the beginning of Britain's own strategic bombing campaign.
Right, I was going to say, I just talked about some of the things we'll see continued into the Second World War. We've seen sort of the introduction of air power in a military sense in a big way in this conflict. Not to say no air power was ever used before. We're mostly talking about sort of dogfighting in the sky, reconnaissance. Of course, we're now seeing a lot more bombing, and that's something that will be extremely important in the Second World War.
On the ground, Ludendorff's offensive switches south, targeting the French. German troops advance 30 miles, but are halted at the River Marne, just as fresh American divisions enter the line. The US 1st Division is the first to see combat at the Battle of Cantigny. 3 days later, the US 2nd Division wins victory at the Battle of Belleau Wood.
You see the Americans arriving. They're all fresh-faced, ready for battle. It's sort of interesting. Typically, you look at warfare, and the introduction of new troops, sometimes can be somewhat of a detriment, right? If you're talking about veterans versus new troops, sometimes those new troops don't have the needed experience. But also, and what we're seeing here, is that when you've got your veteran troops so exhausted, so demoralized, right, so low on supplies and tired, these new fresh-faced troops, they've got a massive, massive advantage, right? That's what we're seeing here. The American soldiers may not have the experience of the Brits and the French and the Germans. And in fact, that may benefit them. They don't have the harrowing experience in PTSD just yet. That might not actually be a benefit to the fighting. But they're also, they don't have the experience, but they do have a lot more energy. And they're coming in with a lot of American supplies and guns and all that sort of stuff.
By now, there are nearly 1 million American soldiers in France.
Wow.
With 10,000 more arriving every day.
Jesus! Okay, so we talked about, Germany being overwhelmed. We said that the Eastern Front ending, Germany was able to move over 500,000 troops to the Western Front. That's a big amount. Look how many Americans are already there. You can see Germany is being overwhelmed. There's no way they can stand up to the amount of manpower that's coming in.
The 4th phase of the German offensive leads to a 9-mile advance, but is finally halted by a French counterattack. In Italy, Austria-Hungary launches an attack at Asiago and the Piave River to support Ludendorff's offensive in France. But it's repulsed with heavy losses, and morale amongst the Austro-Hungarian army collapses. British and French troops land at Murmansk in northern Russia. It's the beginning of Allied intervention in Russia's civil war, on the side of so-called white or anti-Bolshevik forces.
And this will be the start of a massive, bloody, brutal, wide-scale conflict in and beyond Russia. And the Allies get involved on the side of the white forces, the anti-Bolshevik forces, a coalition of, those who are in favor of imperial rule, some sort of liberal types, some far right-wing types, right? You've got a combination. They're sort of allied against the Bolsheviks. This will be a very brutal and bloody conflict. Of course, in the end, the Bolsheviks managed to prevail. There's a lot more to say about that. You can talk about Trotsky. That is sort of outside the scope of this video, but is obviously definitely related as we see the Allied troops beginning to intervene here.
On the Western Front, the Germans' final attack is defeated in the Second Battle of the Marne. Ludendorff's offensive has cost the Germans more than 600,000 casualties, and has failed to make a decisive breakthrough. Germany's final gamble has failed.
Yeah, they pushed far, but they didn't manage to break the Allied lines, especially with the reinforcement of those new American soldiers. In the end, they use a lot of resources and manpower, get a lot of people killed, does not accomplish what Germany needs. Collapse.
The Allies now go on the attack. At the Battle of Amiens, British, Australian, Canadian, and French troops, supported by tanks and aircraft, advance 7 miles in a single day. General Ludendorff calls the 8th of August the Black Day of the German army. German troops are exhausted, hungry, and demoralized.
Exactly right. Germany's used everything to make this push. Like I said, the troops are tired, demoralized, hungry. The Allies, they've been holding the line. Well, they've been being pushed back, but they've been holding with these new, fresh American troops. they're able to push back, right? And the Germans just don't have much left to resist with.
And begin to surrender. Reach the Hindenburg Line.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about momentum throughout this series. Now the momentum is sort of irrevocably turned against Germany, right? They're not coming back from this. You know this is not going in their direction. Now, at that point, the question sort of is, all right, so how is this war going to end, right? Of course, the Entente powers have the upper hand. They're pushing, they can keep pushing. So how are we going to end this, right? That sort of becomes the question as it becomes clear that they've got the upper hand in the military side of the conflict.
A line of reinforced German defences. And break through. Ludendorff informs the Kaiser that the military situation is hopeless.
Yeah.
And that Germany must seek an armistice. Germany sends a request to US President Woodrow Wilson, who in return demands German withdrawal from all occupied territory and the Kaiser's abdication.
Yeah, Germany reaches out to the Americans because they rightly believe that they're going to get the best reception from the United States. This will be a theme we'll see throughout the sort of post-war negotiations, is that there's a lot of recriminations between Germany, Britain, France in particular, Germany and Britain. Sorry, not Germany and Britain. France and Britain, France in particular, wants to punish Germany as much as possible. They want to be as punitive as possible. And so Germany sort of begins turning to the US like, come on now, help us out. I mean, we were just enemies, but you got to step in. Because, of course, Wilson has released his 14 points. He has outlined his vision for the post-war settlement. And so the Germans are sort of like, uh-oh, we'd rather have that than whatever France has in store for us, so begin to see that here.
On the Italian front, the Allies deliver the final blow to Austria-Hungary at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The Austro-Hungarian army disintegrates, and 300,000 prisoners are taken.
Wow.
With the Central Powers facing collapse, the Ottoman Empire signs an armistice with the Allies at Mudros.
First, we've seen the Russian Empire collapse. The Ottomans are going to collapse. The Austrians are going to collapse.
4 days later,
I guess, well, the German Empire is going to collapse as well. It collapses pretty hard. You know, I was going to say maybe a little less. I guess less than Russia. Doesn't necessarily break up in the way that some of these other powers do, but technically Imperial Germany ends. So a lot of empires collapsing as the war draws to a close and in the sort of immediate aftermath of the war.
Austria-Hungary signs an armistice with the Allies at Villa Giusti. At Kiel, the German High Seas Fleet is ordered to make a suicidal attack on the British Navy. But instead, it mutinies. Revolution spreads through Germany. The Kaiser abdicates, and a German republic is proclaimed.
Yeah, so this is where we see the German Revolution, right? Far less known than the Russian Revolution. Perhaps because the Russian Revolution finds a lot more success than the German Revolution does. right? We do have the abdication of the Kaiser, the creation of the Weimar Republic, the short-lived Weimar Republic, frankly. We have this situation where there is rising in the streets, people rise up, the soldiers rise up, right? No one's happy with what is happening. But what occurs, I talked about the Social Democratic Party, I believe in the previous video, Germany's probably most powerful political party. They'd sort of been oppositional to the imperial government at the beginning of World War I. They'd sort of agreed, all right, we'll go along with this. We won't, disagree too much. We'll sort of put our concerns to the side, though this was a decision that caused fracturing within the party itself. Especially some of the more left-wing members were not really on board with this, but at the beginning of the war, the sort of pro-war sentiment was pretty widespread. As the war continues, it becomes less and less popular. The SPD, other German political parties, and leaders begin to speak up. Now, we're coming to the end of the war. We have revolution in the streets. The SPD, essentially led by Friedrich Ebert, he's sort of this moderate-type character. You have revolution from a lot of different people. You've got sort of the left-wing revolutionaries led by Luxemburg, Rosa Luxemburg, and Karl Liebknecht. And what happens, essentially, is that Ebert sort of makes a deal with the old imperial apparatus, the military high command, things like that. He basically is like, all right, we'll keep a lot of you in your positions. We'll sort of keep a lot of the old imperial apparatus if you allow us, the sort of moderate social democrats, to create our new republic. To be fair, this is still a big shift from what happened previously, right? We've gone from an empire to a sort of liberal republic. And what Ebert gets in return is that he turns against the sort of left-wing members of his own movement. Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, they are murdered by some of these Free Corps. We're talking about bands of soldiers in the streets, tended to be right-wing. Ebert sort of working hand in hand with a lot of these former imperial right-wing forces. And this is how we end up with the Weimar Republic. Not a very pretty start. A lot of violence, some betrayal. Of course, goes a different direction than the Bolsheviks, right? They sort of have their liberal revolution, then they have their socialist revolution. You end up with the USSR. Germany, they've got their leftist revolution, sort of gets crushed by a deal or an alliance between the liberals and the right wing, and they have their liberal republic, which is, of course, eventually overthrown by fascism, right? So that's, different directions are gone, but that's essentially 1919. This is not a peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. Essentially correct. Yeah, basically.
The Paris Peace Conference opens at the Palace of Versailles, just outside the French capital. Delegates accept a proposal to create a League of Nations to settle future international disputes.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about the Paris Peace Conference. Obviously, the most famous result is the Treaty of Versailles. But, a lot more happens here than just that. Your great powers of the era, particularly the United States, Britain, and France, these are your big three, but of course there are others involved, are sort of laying the agenda for world politics, right? They are sort of setting up the new global geopolitical order. Now, there are, of course, a lot of maybe not a lot, but there are several moments like this throughout history where a lot of big powers come together and sort of dictate how things are going to be. This is definitely one of them, right? So you get a lot of things resulting from this. Some very big, some relatively small, but look around the world, you can see the impacts of the Paris Peace Conference. But I think here we'll more be talking about the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, we do have the creation of the League of Nations, the sort of predecessor to the UN. The League of Nations, which the United States Congress votes not to join, even though it was Woodrow Wilson's idea. So the US is not a member of it, even though it was sort of their idea in the first place.
The Versailles Treaty, signed in June, imposes harsh terms on Germany. Its military is restricted in size. It must pay war reparations to the Allies. It loses territory to its neighbours. And its colonies are seized by the victors.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like a good time to talk about the consequences of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. I also want to talk about how the war is remembered today, but first, let's talk about Germany in particular, right? The Treaty of Versailles is quite punitive against Germany. Like I said, this is particularly pushed by Britain and France, especially France. They really want to punish Germany. Of course, there's been existing beef between these countries. France is sort of getting one back for the Franco-Prussian War decades prior, right? And so Germany, essentially has to constrain its military, loses a lot of territory, loses its colonies. Now, the way this all ends leaves a very sour taste in the mouth of many Germans. They're upset, both with the end of the war. Of course, you have this German Revolution. It ends with a lot of violence and betrayal. Now, this is the sort of origin of what is called the stabbed in the back myth, right? It's this far-right myth that emerges that essentially says Germany could have won the war if not for our politicians, communists, and Jews betraying us, right? Now, this idea emerges from the fact that the Allies, the Entente powers, push to Germany, and then they sign an armistice and sign the Treaty of Versailles, which is incredibly unpopular in Germany because of how punitive it is, right? The people feel betrayed by their politicians, and that's where this myth sort of comes from, right? And of course, the emergence of this far-right fascist movement, a lot of the blame gets shifted towards the sort of social democratic leadership, who are identified as communists, even though a lot of them are not, and Jews, right? They become the target of a lot of this, and that will, of course, only grow in the years to follow, right? So there's this feeling of betrayal. Like I said, with this German Revolution, Ebert and the sort of more moderate Social Democrats kind of make this deal with the imperial apparatus to allow it to survive. What that means is that in the long term, it can sort of come back and reassert itself, a sort of powerful right-wing force. You have what are called Freikorps throughout Germany, essentially groups of very disgruntled soldiers who are angry and often violent, often quite right-wing, and can be mobilized by these growing right-wing movements, including the Nazi Party, right? So you can sort of see where all of this is building to, right? The conservatives, the right wing, still has a solid base of power. The leftists have essentially been crushed both by the right wing and sort of their own former allies. There's a lot of simmering resentment, both against the Entente powers and against people within their own country. This builds in a very bad direction, and that's really how you get the rise of the Nazi Party, the fascist takeover, of course, along with a lot of economic struggle. Right? We see a lot of this during the Great Depression. So all of this combined is sort of how we get there. And of course, that is how we get to World War II, right? So that's sort of the aftermath of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles as it relates to Germany in particular. There's a lot more to cover, like a lot more, even just talking about Germany, but that's kind of a broad overview.
Germany must also accept responsibility for the war,
right,
in a war guilt clause.
This is one of the most unpopular parts of the Treaty of Versailles. Of course, people are upset about the material conditions imposed, but the fact that Germany has to accept all responsibility strikes many Germans as incredibly unfair, which I think it is, because it's not solely their fault. It's the fault of a lot of people in a lot of countries, but this only makes them more resentful.
a source of lasting resentment in Germany.
Right.
The boundaries of Europe are redrawn. Poland re-emerges after 100 years.
Like I said, after the Paris Peace Conference, we essentially see the establishment of a new global geopolitical order, right? And we can see that in Europe itself. Got the re-emergence of a independent Polish state, which had not been in existence for a long time, right? Poland had been essentially carved up by its neighbors in the late 1700s. There had been a sort of quasi-independent state under Napoleon in the early 1800s. There had been Congress Poland under Russia, but it wasn't really independent. We finally have a new independent Poland for a short period of time, until Soviet domination.
Years of foreign rule, while Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and an enlarged Romania emerged from the ashes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Look at that, Romania.
The Ottoman Empire is dismantled. New states, most under European control, are created in the Middle East.
Which is not what the Arab rebels had been hoping for, right? They had been fighting for independent states of their own. That's what had been promised to them by the Brits. But as we know, Britain had made a lot of promises, one of which was between them and France, and they'd agreed to carve this territory up, make it into protectorates, essentially colonies.
Here, as in Europe, the seeds of future conflict are sown.
Exactly.
While in the Far East, former German possessions in China are handed to Japan, to China's outrage.
Yep. China's pretty upset because they got involved on the side of the Entente, of the Allied powers. They were sending a lot of workers, they were aiding the war effort, and they feel outraged and also resentful that, you know, their territory, which had been previously taken by Russia, is now being given to Japan. You know, that they feel they've been done very dirty, which they have, of course.
World War I claimed the lives of 9.5 million soldiers.
Damn.
1 in 8 of those who fought. 21 million more were wounded. 7 million civilians also lost their lives. Huge areas of Europe were left devastated.
Yeah.
Old empires vanished. New states were born. Lives across the world were transformed. The world was never the same again.
Nope. Alrighty. That was a good video series. I will just say at the end there, a little bit on the remembrance of the First World War, right? Just the discrepancy between the beginning of the conflict, the sort of glorious cheers as everyone got sent off to war, what would hopefully be a quick and valiant war, as that morphed into the discontent of the Long War, right? With all the death, destruction, all the horrific acts, all the PTSD, the starvation, right? All these things. And how the war is remembered today, right? It is remembered more as that horrific event, right? We have a lot of memorials. You know, we sort of recognize it as this terrible, in some ways, sort of pointless war where really not much was gained. Now, not pointless, like we know why it happened, right? I'm not saying that it happened for no reason, but that nothing was really gained from it, right? It was a loss of life for no good reason. I'll put it that way. There was a reason, it wasn't a good one, right? And that is sort of how we still remember it today. We remember it through the sort of horrifying stories, poetry, art of soldiers in those trenches, of the horrifying photographs, right? Not through the sort of valiant, heroic vision of war from the early conflict. I think it's really shaped in many ways how we view war today. And that is sort of, you know, that's very much how we remember this conflict. So it's just sort of interesting, I think, to see that discrepancy, how the war began, how it ended, and sort of how we remember it now as this terrible event that, frankly, victimized a lot of people. You know, of course, some people did heroic things, but I think we more think of a lot of the people involved as victims, frankly, of events outside of their control, which is exactly what it was. So yeah, a good series. It's an older one by Epic History, but definitely a good one. I certainly enjoyed it. If you guys did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all that out of the way, hope you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.